Hello friends, welcome back to Sliders Recaps. Now for my second video, I thought I would go through a little history of how sliding came to be. How did this whole thing develop and build from zero to where it is today? It all goes back to the 80s. We go back to the 80s, and sliding, the term sliding and diving on the ground was originated by a friend of mine. His name was Jay Mead. He was a stuntman at Knott's Halloween Haunt. That was my first haunt experience working somewhere. And he had been working the stunt show, and it rained really bad one of the haunt nights, so they couldn't do the show. And he went out and just started like diving in puddles and sliding in the puddles, kind of scaring people, but more just kind of playing. And one of my other friends said, "Hey, what are you doing?" He's all, "Sliding." So they developed a little bit of a kind of a baseball slide, if you will. You could watch the video here. You can see him kind of diving at people. This is a long time ago. So they would kind of crawl after people and jump at people's feet and things like that. Now what they would do is they would go and get like elbow pads and soft knee pads. They would put these under their shirts and under their jeans. Now they would take leather gloves and they would put duct tape around all the fingers, and they would kind of slap those on the ground. So you didn't really go very far, and you didn't really make a whole lot of noise other than yelling or slapping the ground. But it was a really good scare tactic, and that's what they called sliding before I arrived in 1987. That was my first year. And a buddy of mine came in with a newspaper ad and said, "They're hiring at Knott's for haunt, let's go." And I said, "Yeah," because I've been a few times and I love Halloween stuff. And so off we went to Knott's Halloween auditions. If you've never been to a Halloween audition before, most are probably similar. You go in, and usually there's a row of people sitting behind a table, and they're like, "Act like you're a crazy chainsaw killer," or "Act like someone's killing you with a chainsaw." And so we went in there and we did that. And I guess we did pretty well, because they had asked me to be work in the streets, which was pretty amazing. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I thought, oh, that sounds cool. Before I arrived, it had just been Ghost Town and a couple mazes, and that was about it for most of the haunt. The rest of it was shows and rides and things. So that year, they decided to expand into Camp Snoopy. Now, if you're not familiar with Knott's, if you've never been there, Camp Snoopy is kind of the kiddie zone where they have like ball pits and petting zoo and little rides for the kids. So we're going to expand over there, and since it's pretty close by, we were going to be the same type of characters. We were cowboys, so we were dead cowboys for the most part. Plaid shirt, vest, jeans, boots, and gloves and a mask. The boots we wore were literal cowboy boots. They wanted us to look as much like cowboys as possible. And there was a box of boots, and you'd reach into that box, A, hopefully find a pair, and B, they were never your size. They were either too small and hurt your feet, or they were too big and you had to stuff socks in the toe. For me, the best scares were usually hiding somewhere and jumping out, or I would act as a decoy for some of the bigger guys. I would just lay there and pretend like I was dead, or like a statue or something, and then I would move, and then the other guys would jump in. And that seemed like fun. Now, I saw the guys and heard about the guys over in Ghost Town doing this kind of flopping, sliding around on the ground thing, and I thought, well, that seems pretty cool. But I didn't really know how to get a good scare and make noise. So some friends introduced me to the good old shaker can. This was the standard of scare, and it still is for many. The old shaker can, you just take a plain old aluminum can like one of these, and you throw in some nuts and bolts, and you take that and you seal the top and shake that around. It works, it's effective, does its business. Now for me, I had a habit of taking said shaker can and shaking it, but I would bang it on the ground, and I would scrape it around and stuff like that, and it was cool, but by scraping it around enough, it would break the seams on the top of the can, and eventually the top would pop off or break open, and all my little nuts and bolts would scatter about, and so all I was left with was a empty can, which seems like a bummer. However, I found that if you scrape this can on the ground, and I have some sandpaper down here, if you scrape this on the ground, you get a great sound. you can get some really great scraping. And scraping on the ground with metal is the key to this scare. That's how this works. Metal scraping on the ground is always a head turner no matter where you go, whether it's a gate or a piece of metal hanging off a car that goes by and it's scraping like a muffler. Everybody looks and everybody wants to know what's happening. And if that scraping noise is coming right at you, trust me, people will move, and they do get freaked out by that. So after doing that a few times, one of my buddies said, hey, you know what? I'm going to take that can, and he would bend it this way with a pair of pliers, and then he would bend it this way with his, smashing it down either with a vise or with pliers. And then we ended up with one of these, which we called slider cans. And that was these. So it's flat on this side, and then it's bent up like a T in the middle, and then we bent it over so it would have like a handle. So we would take these and scrape these on the ground, and trust me, they are loud. This makes a lot of noise. And the bigger the can, the louder the sound. It has some negatives to it though. The biggest negatives are, number one, what do you do with them? You can't stick them in your pocket, and you can't set them, if you set them down, you have to go back for them every time you set them down. So if you look at this picture right here, you can see that I took some cheesecloth and I just sort of wrapped it through and basically tied it to my hands so that I could walk around. I could relax my hands and drop my arms and they wouldn't fall to the ground. But then I have these in my hands the whole time. I did see a guy over in Ghost Town while passing through one night who had knee pads that had the little white plastic circle on it. They were like carpet layers pads, basically. The skateboard pads as we know them, they did not exist. You could not get them anywhere. Skateboarding had been huge in the 70s and really popular, but then all the skateboard parks is where you would buy the big knee pads with the recaps that went over the front and the padded gloves that you could wear so you could go up the big cement ramps on either way. And all those went out of business because they all insurance problems and things like that. So nobody sold the big knee pads anymore. There was no Amazon. There was no, if they weren't at Sears or the mall, they didn't exist. And skateboard parts, for that matter, were only found in bike shops. So I went out and I bought some of those little carpet layer pads. If you look at this picture in a little wider shot, you can see my little white discs on my knees there. We would take these cans and we would crawl into a bush with a wall behind it, and we would plant our feet against the wall and we would push out against the thing, and we'd have the little plastic knee pads on and scrape out in front of people, and they'd jump, and that was kind of fun. And then we also could maybe get a step or two and just sort of fall and scrape these on the ground. Again, sliding on those little caps. Luckily those pads were cheap, but we would scrape through those in 6 or 8 slides, I think. They were really, really not designed for that. We took our slider cans and we were using them, and after one weekend, we went back and we went into the place where we get dressed, which we call Warehouse P. And one of the costumers and managers saw us with our little slider cans. And they said, oh, what do you got there? And we're like, well, we use these and we scrape them on the ground, and they were made out of shaker cans and they're louder. It's a cooler scare. It's on the ground. And they looked at them, and this is where we come up with the second very large negative for these cans, is scraping them on the ground like that, you're basically sharpening them. So these edges would get really sharp, and the corners, these points, would get very sharp. And they were a little nervous about those sharp edges being near guests while we're whipping by their feet, or if they trip, or if something happens and we run into them. So after that one weekend of using these, they were gone. I loved that metal scraping on the ground sound though. It was such a great noise. So I was wondering, how can I get that same sound? Well, what if I put some pieces of metal on a glove? That way I can still use my fingers and I could scrape them around that way. So I went down to the local hardware store and I found a pair of just regular workman's gloves. And I asked the guy, how would I attach washers, like metal washers or chunks of metal, to a leather glove? And he stared at me for a long time. And he said, what's this for? And I said, well, this is Halloween. I'm scaring people, scraping things on the ground. Okay, but anyway, I just took the washers and I glued them to the glove. Washers on the palms and washers on the fingers. The little washers that were on there were awesome, but I had caught some on some cracks and it had jammed a finger pretty bad, and so I wanted something a little rounder and a little better. So I made these crazy fingertips that I showed you in the first video with the little strapping tape on there, and now I'm not worried I'm going to hurt anybody. And that was working really well. I'm like, man, I wish I had a pair of those big, thick knee pads. So I went to a random bike shop, and I went in there and I said, hey, do you sell the big knee pads, like for ramps? They're like, nobody sells those. And I said, well, there used to be plastic caps you could put over top of those, stick them on with Velcro or whatever, or double stick tape, and it would keep those on. Do you have those by chance? She thought about it for a second. She reached under the counter. She pulled out a blue Vans shoebox and quite literally blew dust off the top. And she creaked them open, and it was like Pulp Fiction, like gold shooting up out of there. There were 4 pair of brand new plastic recaps, blue and orange. And she said, is this what you're looking for? And I said, oh my God, yes. I bought the whole box. So I took those and I had to build knee pads. So I went and got the thickest volleyball knee pads, like the padded kind that I could get. And I hot glued the cap to the knee pad. So I hot glued that on and that became my knee pads. So now I've got a little bit more distance, but I'm dragging cowboy boots, literal cowboy boots. I'm running around in these things, and I burned through the boots, through my sock until my skin was scraping on the ground. And I thought, this is a bad idea. I should not be in these boots. I went down to Goodwill and I found a pair of army boots that were my size, that were pretty comfortable. Still kind of looked like boots, and people were kind of moving to that anyway because nobody wanted to wear those old gross boots in those boxes. Now the part of the knee pad, like the recap that's on here, this middle part ends up burning out. But you can see like the top edges, nothing touches that. So this stays really thick plastic. So I felt like that was a little bit of a waste. Plus, it's got a natural curve to it. And I thought, you know what? That looks like the end of my shoe. So I would take a saw and I would just cut these off at the top. And it actually made like a toe piece. And I would glue that onto the toes of my army boots. And that gave me some more speed. So now I got the gloves, and I got the knee pads, and I got the boots, and now I could get more distance and I can run faster. And I actually found that if I ran hard enough, when I hit the ground, I would actually speed up. I would accelerate and go faster. And I can be picking people out 30, 40 yards out and decide that's the person I want to go after. And we just go, and I would meet in the middle and shoot right across them and get these big scares. And we were getting great reactions in the area we were in. There was actually an area that was real narrow, and people would walk through and people would get scared, and then they would sit to the side and wait for the next group. And they would get scared and they would sit to the side and wait for the next group. And we had huge crowds on either side and people walking through like, why are all these people here? Whoosh, we'd come through, they'd jump, yay, and everybody would cheer. It was like super fun. So someone got a hold of that and saw it and said, hey, we need to move those guys over to Ghost Town. So we did. We moved over to Ghost Town, and I brought my sliding stuff with me. Now, opening night, my first time in Ghost Town, a couple of guys came over. Bobby, Wade, you know who you are. They came in and they were going to be our trainers. And they said, okay, here's how you work in Ghost Town. And I know some of you guys from over there, but here's how we do it here. And one of the things you can do is called sliding. And everybody's like pointing at me, and I'm like, what? So they said, here's how you do it. Now they were still doing it with the wrap around the elbow and wrap around the big foam, thick pads. And they're like, here's how you do it. You dive on the ground, you slap the ground, you crawl like this and that. And everybody just says, oh my God, you have to show them what you're doing. You have to do it. But it was training night. I didn't have any gear. I didn't have anything. It was just looking around and showing how to do it. So I go out on my first night and I spied a target way out there, like 30, 40 feet away. I took a couple of big strides and I hit the ground and I slid past them, making the scraping noise with my hands. And 8 monsters came out of the fog right here on me, and they were like, "What are you wearing?" And I'm like, "This is what I've been using over there. I got these pads that I made, and I got these gloves." "Oh my God, I gotta get those. How do I get them?" And I said, "I built them. I built it from scratch, basically. I built all of it." So you couldn't get the skateboard knee pads until Tony Hawk happened. Tony Hawk shows up and skateboarding re-explodes. So now it's not just skateboarding on the ground, but it's like ramps, and skate parks are going to come back and all these crazy things. So if they're going to have that, you got to have the elbow pads and the knee pads and all that stuff, which they did. And we went out and immediately tried to buy whatever pads we could find, and most of them were really expensive. They were like $80 to try and buy these pads. But we spent almost all of our haunt money on just gear and making things. And now we've got those, and then eventually the steel caps came along, and it just expanded and expanded. And then I found the other fingertip pieces. I'll go over that in the glove video, how I discovered those. And now it is what it is today. That's how sliding got started, and that's how it went all the way till now, and hopefully into the future. I hope you've enjoyed these stories. I've had a lot of fun telling them to you and showing some of these old videos and pictures. And if you want to see more about this, in the description below, I've added links to 2 really great documentaries that are out there. One called Seasons of Screams, which was done back in the 90s, and it is all of haunt pretty much from day one. So the first guys that went out there, they did interviews with them, and all the first handful of guys that went out and scared people in Ghost Town, and that's all there was, up to, well, semi-current day, up to about the year 2000, and they talk about all that stuff. A lot of great stories in there, and I describe a little bit of this. And then if you want to check out Sliders of Ghost Town, which Braden Freeland of Be Free Media, a buddy of mine out there, put that together. It's a really good documentary about sliding and how we put this together. Now, some of this, you'll hear some of these same little stories from myself talking about that, but you can also hear from a lot of the other sliders that also came up through it about the same time I did, and just pretty much took the gear that I came up with and then turned it into something else that's just fantastic. As I said in the first video, this is a great haunt scare, but it can be fun almost any time of year. Not scaring people necessarily, but just getting out and getting some exercise, learning some of the tricks. I hope you guys enjoyed the little history lesson, and get out there, make yourself some gear, and get going. We'll be back soon with the gloves video. You guys can figure out how to make your own gloves. All right, have a great day. I'll see you next time on Sliders Recaps.